The first red flag should have been the pristine white fence. Sarah Martinez had lived in suburban neighborhoods long enough to know that no fence stayed that immaculate without obsessive maintenance, and obsessive people rarely make easy neighbors. But after 18 months of apartment living with paper-thin walls and a neighbor who practiced drums at midnight, the modest two-story house on Maple Street felt like paradise. The previous owners had warned her about quirky neighbors, but Sarah figured she could handle quirky. She handled worse. Mrs. Catherine Henderson lived in the mirror image house next door, and from day one, she made it clear that Maple Street had standards. A 70-something woman with silver hair pulled into a perfect bun appeared on Sarah's doorstep within hours of the moving truck's departure, bearing homemade cookies and a list of neighborhood guidelines. Not official HOA rules, their street was blessedly free of such bureaucracy, but Mrs. Henderson's personal expectations for maintaining property values and community aesthetics. Garbage bins must be stored out of sight except on collection days. Mrs. Henderson had recited, standing ramrods straight in her pressed floral dress. Lawn height shouldn't exceed 2.5 inches, and absolutely no decorative elements that clash with the neighborhood's established character. Her pale blue eyes had lingered meaningfully on Sarah's colorful garden gnomes. Sarah had smiled politely, accepting the cookies while mentally filing the lecture under ignore completely. She bought her house, not enrolled in military school. For 3 months, they coexisted in polite tension. Mrs. Henderson would peer disapprovingly over their shared fence whenever Sarah worked in her garden, muttering about unconventional choices, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Sarah learned to wave cheerfully and turn up her music in response. The real trouble started with the October rains. Sarah first noticed the standing water on a Tuesday morning, rushing out to her car for work only to find her backyard transformed into a shallow lake. The previous evening's moderate rainfall shouldn't have caused such flooding, especially since the property had excellent drainage when she toured it. The real estate agent had specifically mentioned the sophisticated water management system shared between her property and Mrs. Henderson's, an underground drainage pipe that channeled rainwater from both yards into the storm sewer system. By Thursday, after 2 more days of rain, the situation had worsened. Sarah's flower beds were drowning, and she could smell the stagnant water from inside her house. That evening, she grabbed a flashlight and rain boots to investigate the drainage system's outlet point near the back fence line. What she found made her stomach drop. The drainage pipe opening was completely blocked, not by debris or natural accumulation, but by a neat arrangement of decorative river rocks, carefully mortared into place. Someone had deliberately sealed the pipe, creating an attractive stone feature that effectively destroyed the drainage system's functionality. The craftsmanship was meticulous, professional, even designed to look like an intentional landscaping choice. Sarah stared at the blockage in disbelief, water lapping at her boots. This wasn't accidental. Someone had planned this, invested time and money in creating a beautiful disaster that was slowly destroying her property. And given the location, precisely on the property line where Mrs. Henderson's prized garden met Sarah's fence, there was only one possible culprit. The next morning, Sarah approached Mrs. Henderson's front door with diplomatic intentions. She rehearsed a neighborly conversation about the drainage issue, assuming there had been some misunderstanding or miscommunication with the landscaper. Surely once Mrs. Henderson understood the problem, they could resolve it quickly and amicably. Mrs. Henderson answered the door in her typical pressed attire, but her expression was anything but welcoming. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope you have a moment to discuss our shared drainage system," Sarah began carefully. "I've discovered the outlet pipe has been blocked and it's causing flooding in my yard. I wanted to coordinate with you before calling a professional to clear it." The older woman's face hardened. "I have no idea what you're talking about. The drainage pipe near our back fence, it's been sealed with decorative stones. The rain has nowhere to go and my property is flooding. That's unfortunate for you, but I don't see how it concerns me." Sarah felt her diplomatic resolve wavering. "Mrs. Henderson, the stones are on your side of the property line. Your landscaper must have installed them. Surely it was just an oversight." "Young lady," Mrs. Henderson interrupted, her voice dropping to an icy whisper, "I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you cannot prove. My property is perfectly maintained according to my standards, and I will not have you suggesting otherwise." The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there, with Mrs. Henderson denying all knowledge of the blocked drainage while simultaneously defending her right to beautify her property as she saw fit. When Sarah mentioned potentially fixing the problem herself, Mrs. Henderson threatened to call the police for trespassing and property damage. Standing in her flooded backyard that evening, Sarah realized she was dealing with something far worse than a quirky neighbor. She was facing a calculating saboteur who had deliberately damaged shared infrastructure and would lie boldly to protect her actions. The weather forecast called for storms all week. Sarah pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. If Mrs. Henderson wanted to play games, Sarah would make sure she documented everything. Some lessons she was beginning to understand could only be learned. Armed with her phone, a measuring tape, and the original property survey she'd received during closing, Sarah methodically photographed every angle of the blocked drainage pipe. The decorative stone arrangement was even more elaborate in daylight. Mrs. Henderson had created a miniature Zen garden complete with carefully raked sand patterns around the sealed pipe opening. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely devastating to the shared water management system. The property survey confirmed Sarah's suspicions. The drainage pipe ran directly along the property line with the outlet positioned precisely at the boundary between both yards. According to the documentation, both homeowners held easement rights to maintain the drainage system, meaning Mrs. Henderson had violated their shared agreement by blocking it without consultation. Sarah's research didn't stop there. A trip to the county records office revealed the drainage system's history and exposed a disturbing pattern. The pipe had been installed 15 years earlier after severe flooding issues plagued both properties. The previous owners of Sarah's house, the Kowalskis, had split the installation costs with Mrs. Henderson, creating a legal agreement that explicitly prohibited either party from obstructing the drainage without mutual consent. More troubling was what Sarah discovered in the complaint records. Over the past decade, 3 different neighbors had filed noise complaints, property line disputes, and nuisance reports against Mrs. Henderson. The most recent case involved the previous homeowner on the other side of Mrs. Henderson's property, who'd apparently moved out after a 2-year battle over tree trimming rights and fence placement. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just difficult. She was a serial property bully who'd driven away multiple neighbors through calculated harassment and legal intimidation. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah decided to try one more diplomatic approach. She drafted a carefully worded letter explaining the legal situation, including copies of the easement agreement and photos of the blocked drainage. She proposed a simple solution. Mrs. Henderson could relocate her decorative stones to another area of her garden, and they could share the cost of properly maintaining the drainage system going forward. Sarah hand-delivered the letter on a Thursday afternoon, catching Mrs. Henderson as she pruned her prize-winning roses. "I hope you'll reconsider our drainage situation," Sarah said pleasantly, extending the envelope. "I'd included some documentation that might help clarify the legal aspects." Mrs. Henderson took the letter without looking at it, her pruning shears snapping ominously close to Sarah's fingers. "Legal aspects? Are you threatening me now?" "Not at all. I'm trying to find a solution that works for both of us. The easement agreement shows we both have rights and responsibilities regarding the drainage system." "Rights and responsibilities," Mrs. Henderson repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Let me tell you about rights, young lady. I have the right to maintain my property as I see fit. I have the right to create beautiful landscaping that enhances our neighborhood's character. And I have the right not to be harassed by entitled newcomers who think they can dictate how I manage my own garden." Sarah felt her patience evaporating. "Mrs. Henderson, your beautiful landscaping is flooding my property. The drainage pipe serves both our houses. This isn't about aesthetics, it's about basic infrastructure." "Infrastructure?" Mrs. Henderson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That ugly pipe was an eyesore. It completely disrupted the flow of my garden design. I spent $3,000 having it properly integrated into a water feature that actually adds value to both our properties." The admission was stunning. Mrs. Henderson had just confessed to deliberately blocking the drainage while simultaneously claiming it benefited Sarah's property. The woman's entitlement was breathtaking in its audacity. "A water feature that doesn't drain water," Sarah said slowly. "Mrs. Henderson, you've created a dam, not a water feature. My yard floods every time it rains now. That sounds like your problem. Perhaps you should invest in better landscaping instead of cluttering your yard with those hideous garden gnomes." The conversation spiraled downward from there. Mrs. Henderson refused to read Sarah's documentation, dismissed the easement agreement as irrelevant historical paperwork, and threatened to call her son, apparently a lawyer, if Sarah continued harassing her. When Sarah mentioned potentially hiring a professional to assess the drainage situation, Mrs. Henderson's threats escalated to promises of lawsuits for trespassing, property damage, and harassment. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Mrs. Henderson hissed, waving her pruning shears for emphasis. "I've lived on this street for 30 years. I know every city council member, every code enforcement officer, and every judge in this county. You're a nobody who moved here 5 minutes ago thinking you can push around established residents. I will bury you in legal paperwork if you so much as touch my property improvements." Sarah walked away from that encounter with her hands shaking, not from fear, but from rage. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just entitled, she was a neighborhood terrorist who'd been getting away with property bullying for decades through intimidation and empty legal threats. That evening, Sarah made 2 important phone calls. The first was to her homeowner's insurance company, reporting potential water damage and requesting documentation of the drainage dispute. The second was to a local attorney who specialized in property law. Easement violations are serious business, the lawyer explained during their consultation. If your neighbor has deliberately obstructed shared infrastructure, you have grounds for legal action. But litigation is expensive and time-consuming. Have you considered involving the city's code enforcement department? Sarah hadn't, but it was an excellent suggestion. If Mrs. Henderson wanted to play the I know people game, Sarah would find out exactly how well-connected her elderly neighbor really was when city officials started investigating unpermitted modifications to drainage systems. The code enforcement complaint was filed online that same evening, complete with photographs, property surveys, and copies of the original easement agreement. Sarah also documented Mrs. Henderson's threats and submitted them as evidence of intimidation attempts. As she hit the submit button, Sarah noticed the weather forecast had updated. A major storm system was approaching from the southwest, promising several days of heavy rainfall starting Monday. The meteorologists were already warning about potential flooding in low-lying areas. Sarah's house sat in a natural depression that relied entirely on the block drainage system for water management. She looked out her window at Mrs. Henderson's pristine garden with its $3,000 decorative stone arrangement and felt a grim sense of anticipation. Some people, she reflected, only learn through consequences. And consequences, according to the Weather Service, were scheduled to arrive in 72 hours. Mrs. Henderson was about to get a very expensive education in the importance of proper drainage. Sarah woke to her phone buzzing with emergency alerts from the National Weather Service. A massive low-pressure system was strengthening as it moved across the plains, drawing moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and promising to dump unprecedented rainfall across the region. What had started as predictions of moderate to heavy rain were now upgraded to potentially catastrophic flooding, with rainfall totals that made meteorologists use words like historic and life-threatening. The local news was already running continuous coverage, interviewing emergency management officials who urged residents to prepare for power outages, road closures, and basement flooding. The storm system was unusual in its size and intensity, a slow-moving behemoth that would park over their area for days rather than passing through quickly. Sarah stood in her backyard, surveying the still-flooded areas from the previous week's minor rainfall. If moderate showers had turned her yard into a swamp, what would happen when the storm of the decade arrived? Her house sat at the bottom of a natural slope, with both her property and Mrs. Henderson's designed to channel water toward the now-blocked drainage system. Without that outlet, the water would have nowhere to go except up. She needed to try one more time. Sarah found Mrs. Henderson in her front yard, directing two landscapers who were installing additional decorative elements around her prized garden. The irony was breathtaking. While weather services warned of historic flooding, Mrs. Henderson was adding more ornamental features to her drainage-blocking masterpiece. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah called out, approaching carefully. "Have you seen the weather warnings? We're looking at several days of extremely heavy rain starting Sunday night." The older woman didn't look up from her consultation with the landscapers. Weather predictions are notoriously unreliable. I've lived here for 30 years and I've heard apocalyptic forecasts before. This is different. The meteorologists are calling it a potentially historic storm. With our drainage pipe blocked, both our properties could flood severely. Mrs. Henderson finally turned, her expression radiating annoyance. "Are you still harping about that drainage nonsense? I thought I made my position clear." "Your position could cost us both thousands in flood damage," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. "The block pipe doesn't just affect my yard anymore. When the water level rises high enough, it'll back up into both our basements. Your basement is actually lower than mine." One of the landscapers paused his work, glancing between the two women with obvious discomfort. Even he seemed to understand the implications of Sarah's warning. Mrs. Henderson, however, remained unmoved. "Young lady, your attempts to frighten me with weather hysteria are transparent and pathetic. My property has been perfectly maintained for decades. I've weathered every storm nature has thrown at this neighborhood, and I've never had flooding issues because I invest in proper landscaping and drainage solutions." "Proper drainage solutions that block the actual drainage," Sarah said, her diplomatic facade finally cracking. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm trying to help you understand. Help me." Mrs. Henderson's voice rose to a near shriek. "You're trying to manipulate me into destroying my beautiful garden improvements because you're too cheap to fix your own property's water management problems. My landscaping represents thousands of dollars in professional design work that enhances the entire neighborhood's property values." The landscaper who'd been listening stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, if there's a drainage issue, maybe we should." "It should continue working on what I'm paying you for," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "I don't need landscaping advice from someone who clearly doesn't understand proper water feature integration." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Mrs. Henderson the latest weather update. "Look at this rainfall prediction. 8 to 12 inches over 3 days, with some areas potentially seeing more. That's not normal rain. That's flood-producing rainfall." Mrs. Henderson glanced at the screen dismissively. Weather apps are designed to create panic. They make everything sound catastrophic to drive viewership for their advertisers. I've seen predictions like this dozens of times, and it always turns out to be much less dramatic than they claim. Mrs. Henderson, please. I'm not trying to attack your garden. I'm trying to prevent disaster for both of us. If you won't remove the stones permanently, could you at least temporarily clear the drainage opening until the storm passes? Absolutely not. My landscape design is a cohesive artistic vision. I'm not going to vandalize my own property based on your weather paranoia and property envy. Property envy. Sarah stared at the woman in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson genuinely believed that Sarah's concern about impending floods was motivated by jealousy over decorative rocks. This isn't about your garden, Sarah said slowly. This is about basic physics. Water has to go somewhere. If it can't drain through the pipe, it's going to pool until it finds another way out, like through our basement walls. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before buying a house with inadequate drainage, Mrs. Henderson replied tartly. Homeownership comes with responsibilities. Maybe it's time you learn to handle yours instead of trying to blame your problems on neighbors who actually take pride in their properties. The conversation was hopeless. Mrs. Henderson had moved beyond stubborn into complete delusion, convincing herself that blocking shared infrastructure was not only acceptable but beneficial. She reframed Sarah's legitimate concerns as personal attacks and weather warnings as hysteria. One of the landscapers caught Sarah's eye and shook his head slightly, a gesture of sympathy from someone who clearly understood the situation better than his employer. But he wasn't going to contradict a paying customer, especially one as volatile as Mrs. Henderson. Sarah made one final attempt. Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to ask you directly. When this storm hits and the water starts rising, will you at least consider temporarily clearing the drainage pipe before it's too late? The only thing I'll consider, Mrs. Henderson said icily, is calling the police if you continue trespassing on my property to harass me about my landscaping choices. Now leave. I have professional work to supervise. Sarah walked home through air that felt thick and oppressive, the atmospheric pressure dropping as the massive storm system approached. The weather apps on her phone were updating hourly with increasingly alarming predictions. The storm had strengthened further and the rainfall estimates were climbing. Some models now show the possibility of 15 inches of rain over 4 days. That evening, Sarah made practical preparations. She moved everything valuable from her basement to higher floors, bought a battery-powered radio, stocked up on water and non-perishable food, and purchased a small sump pump as insurance. She also printed out copies of all her documentation about the drainage dispute, sealing them in waterproof bags along with her insurance information. Her final preparation was sending a certified letter to Mrs. Henderson, delivered by overnight mail. The letter was brief and formal. Mrs. Henderson, this serves as final notice that the blocked drainage pipe between our properties poses a serious flood risk during the approaching storm. Weather services predict 8 to 15 inches of rainfall over the next 4 days. I am formally requesting that you temporarily clear the drainage opening to prevent property damage to both our homes. If you choose not to act on this warning, please be aware that I have documented the drainage obstruction and our previous conversations about this issue. My insurance company and legal counsel have been notified of the situation. I hope we can still resolve this matter before the storm arrives. Sarah Martinez. She scheduled the letter for Saturday morning delivery, giving Mrs. Henderson one final opportunity to make the right choice before the weather turned dangerous. Saturday afternoon, Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Mrs. Henderson signed for the certified letter. The older woman read it on her front porch, her face darkening with each line. When she finished, she crumpled the letter and threw it into her decorative trash can with theatrical disgust. Then she went back inside without even glancing toward the blocked drainage pipe. That evening, the first drops of rain began to fall. By Sunday morning, the storm would arrive in full force, bringing with it a reckoning that Mrs. Henderson had repeatedly refused to acknowledge. Sarah had done everything possible to prevent the coming disaster. Now she would only document what happened next and hope that her own preparations would be enough to weather the storm that her neighbors' pride and entitlement had made infinitely worse. Sarah's documentation project began at dawn the next day. Armed with her phone, a measuring tape, and the original property survey she received during closing, Sarah methodically photographed every angle of the blocked drainage pipe. Dawn broke gray and sodden on Thursday morning, revealing a neighborhood transformed by nature's reckoning. Sarah emerged from her house into an eerie stillness punctuated only by the distant sound of emergency vehicles and the steady drip of water from every surface. The storm had finally moved on, leaving behind a landscape that looked like it had been rearranged by an angry giant. Trees lay across power lines, debris filled the streets, and the air carried the musty smell of flood damage and mud. But it was the sight of Mrs. Henderson's property that truly captured the scope of the disaster. The pristine garden that had once been the pride of Maple Street was completely destroyed. What had been carefully manicured flower beds were now muddy craters filled with standing water and debris. The decorative stone arrangement that had caused so much trouble was scattered across the yard like broken teeth, the $3,000 water feature reduced to expensive rubble. Her prized rose bushes were either uprooted entirely or buried under inches of mud and sediment. The white fence that had been Sarah's first warning about her difficult neighbor now leaned at a drunken angle. Several sections completely collapsed under the weight of flood debris. Pool toys, garden furniture, and unidentifiable chunks of what had once been someone's patio decorations were tangled throughout the destruction. But the real devastation was inside Mrs. Henderson's house. Through the basement windows, Sarah could see the water line that marked the flood's high point, nearly 4 feet up the basement walls. Mrs. Henderson's finished basement, which she had once bragged contained thousands of dollars in antique furniture and family heirloom storage, was completely ruined. Soggy cardboard boxes and waterlogged furniture were visible through the murky glass, floating in the remaining standing water like the remnants of a shipwreck. Sarah's own property told a dramatically different story. While her yard showed obvious signs of heavy rainfall and some minor flooding, the damage was minimal. Her flower beds were muddy but intact, her fence remained standing, and most importantly, her basement was completely dry. A slight elevation difference between the two properties, maybe 18 inches, had made all the difference once the blocked drainage system created an artificial dam effect. The water had pooled in Mrs. Henderson's low-lying property first, and when it could no longer be contained there, it sought the path of least resistance through her basement foundation rather than continuing uphill to Sarah's house. At 9:30 that morning, Sarah's doorbell rang. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch, and the transformation was shocking. Gone was the imperious woman in pressed clothing who had terrorized the neighborhood for decades. This Mrs. Henderson looked decades older, her silver hair disheveled, her usually perfect makeup absent, wearing muddy clothes that suggested she'd been wading through her flooded basement. Her pale blue eyes, once sharp with entitlement, now held the hollow look of someone confronting the consequences of their own actions. "Sarah," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to ask for your help." The words seemed to physically pain her, each syllable extracted like a splinter. "My basement is completely flooded. The water is too deep for me to get to my electrical panels safely, and I can't find my circuit breaker to shut off the power. I'm afraid to go down there alone, and my son can't get here until this afternoon because of the road closures." Sarah studied her neighbor's face, seeing genuine fear beneath humiliation. Whatever else Mrs. Henderson might be, she was still a 70-something woman dealing with a dangerous situation alone. "Of course," Sarah said simply. "Let me get my boots and flashlight." Working together in the murky basement water, they managed to safely shut off the electrical system and assess the damage. It was worse than it had appeared from outside. The water had reached nearly 4.5 feet at its peak, destroying everything stored on the basement floor and most items on lower shelves. Photo albums, holiday decorations, furniture, and what appeared to be decades of accumulated possessions were ruined beyond salvage. Mrs. Henderson stood in the middle of the destruction, tears finally breaking through her composure. 50 years of memories," she whispered. "My husband's workshop, our children's baby photos, my mother's china cabinet that survived the Depression." Sarah found herself feeling genuinely sorry for the older woman despite everything that had happened. Watching someone confront the destruction of a lifetime's accumulation was heartbreaking, regardless of how that destruction had come to pass. "Your insurance should cover most of this," Sarah offered gently. Mrs. Henderson's laugh was bitter. "That's what I thought too, until I spoke with my agent this morning." The insurance situation, as it turned out, was Mrs. Henderson's final lesson in consequences. Her homeowner's policy covered flood damage from external sources, burst pipes, storm damage, natural disasters. But it specifically excluded damage caused by homeowner modifications to drainage systems and preventable flooding due to property maintenance issues. The insurance investigator who arrived that afternoon took one look at the blocked drainage pipe, reviewed Sarah's documented complaints and warnings, and classified the flooding as self-inflicted damage due to deliberate infrastructure modification. Mrs. Henderson's insurance would cover wind damage to her roof and fence, but the tens of thousands in basement flooding damage was her responsibility alone. "How was I supposed to know?" she asked Sarah desperately as they watched the insurance investigator photograph the scattered decorative stones. "I just wanted my garden to look beautiful. I never intended for this to happen." Sarah bit back the obvious response that she had tried to warn Mrs. Henderson repeatedly, that weather services had provided days of advance notice, that basic common sense should have suggested that blocking drainage during a major storm was dangerous. Instead, she focused on practical matters. "The city has emergency flood relief resources," Sarah offered, "and there are contractors who specialize in flood remediation. The sooner you start the cleanup, the better chance you have of preventing mold damage." Over the following days, a parade of contractors, insurance adjusters, and city officials tramped through Mrs. Henderson's ruined property. The code enforcement complaint Sarah had filed gained new urgency when investigators discovered that the decorative stone installation had been done without permits and violated multiple city ordinances regarding shared drainage systems. Mrs. Henderson faced fines totaling nearly $1,500 for the unpermitted modifications, plus the cost of professionally restoring the drainage system to proper functioning order. The landscaping company that had installed the stones initially refused to take responsibility, claiming they had simply followed the homeowner's instructions. The legal battle loomed over who would pay for the remediation work. But the most significant change was in Mrs. Henderson herself. A week after the flood, she appeared at Sarah's door again, this time with a plate of homemade cookies and a formal apology letter. "I owe you more than an apology," she said, standing straighter than she had since the disaster. "You tried to warn me multiple times, and I dismissed your concerns as personal attacks. I let my pride and my need to control everything around me cloud my judgment. I put both our homes at risk because I couldn't admit I might be wrong." The apology was thorough and genuine, acknowledging not just the immediate drainage issue, but years of difficult behavior toward multiple neighbors. Mrs. Henderson had apparently spent the week reflecting on more than just flood damage. "I've spoken with my son about my behavior over the years," she continued. "He helped me understand that I've been difficult. I drove away good neighbors because I was more concerned with having things my way than building relationships. The Kowalskis, the Garcias, even the Johnsons before them, and they weren't bad neighbors. I was." Sarah accepted the apology graciously, though she remained cautiously optimistic about lasting change. The drainage system restoration took another 2 weeks, with Mrs. Henderson bearing the full cost of professional excavation, pipe cleaning, and proper reinstallation. The decorative stones were relocated to a different area of her garden, creating an attractive feature that didn't interfere with essential infrastructure. Mrs. Henderson's basement renovation took months and cost nearly $30,000, money that came directly from her retirement savings since insurance wouldn't cover the self-inflicted damage. The financial impact was